In today's day, I'm going to talk about how to pass a job interview with Blue Origin when it comes to the behavioral and introductory questions. The main idea is that the company's cultural attributes are structured quite similarly to Amazon's, which is basically a set of principles which are core to what they do and, of course, how they hire. And since I'm pretty experienced with Amazon interviews, I thought I'd share some help on this topic as well. Basically, you can expect questions from most of the 12 principles, which can also be called behaviors. The better you prepare stories to highlight on these, the more likely you are to do well with your interviews. The definition of behavioral interview is one where the interviewer is asking you for your previous experiences in a bid to predict your future performance on the job. Next, I'm going to give you the best sample questions for you to brainstorm on for each of these 12 cultural attributes, and I recommend you come up with your best stories for each. Right? First, passion for our mission, or think big. Question: tell me about a time when you were working on an initiative or goal and saw an opportunity to do something much bigger or better than the initial focus. Did you take that opportunity? Why or why not? What was the outcome? So do you have a story in mind here? Because actually your end goal would be to end up with a story bank with your best anecdotes around all these principles or cultural attributes if you want. Building your story bank can be a lengthy process, especially if you're doing it for the first time. Okay. Leadership principle number 2, bias for action. Give me an example of a calculated risk that you have taken where speed was critical. What was the situation? How did you handle it? What steps did you take to mitigate the risk? What was the outcome? Knowing what you know now, would you have done anything differently? So again, the idea is to come up with your best story to highlight your bias for action. Professional experiences, of course. Now, as a quick tip here, some of your best stories will fit into multiple leadership principles, and since they're your best stories, you will probably be tempted to use them more than once during your interview. Oh, it's Blue Origin. Okay, yeah. I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right, so you may not use a story twice during your interview, and they will be specifically tracking this during the exchange, and that's one of the key reasons why they actually take notes. Next, deliver results. Give me an example of a time when you were able to deliver an important project under a tight deadline. What sacrifices did you have to make to meet the deadline? How did they impact the final deliverable? What was the final outcome? So do you have something in mind here? If so, please write it down. Even consider writing your stories as detailed as possible. Even make a brain dump of several pages, including all the possible metrics you can remember. This is the best method to prevent superficial answers during your interview. Okay, why is it a good idea to write lengthy stories? For example, if your story is 3 pages initially, you could eventually then trim down the fat to answer a specific question, whereas if your story is just a one-liner, chances are you'll have to develop on that during the interview, and also, importantly, remember all the details during your interview, which isn't the best employment of your time at that point. Okay, next one. Have backbone, disagree, and commit. Tell me about the time when you strongly disagreed with your manager or peer on something you considered very important to the business. What was it and how did you handle it? Knowing what you know now, would you do anything differently? So maybe worth mentioning here that Amazon and Blue Origin as well have what's called the backbone test, which I believe is pretty self-explanatory. And from experience, the challenge here is to spot the precise moment when they check your backbone during the interview. Okay, so listening skills is something which pays off with behavioral interviews in particular. Next one, earn the trust of others. Tell me about the time when you had to communicate a change in direction that you anticipated people would have concerns with. What did you do to understand the concerns and to mitigate them? Were there any changes you made along the way after hearing these concerns? How do you handle questions and/or resistance? Were you able to get people comfortable with the change? So do you have a story in mind of a time when you earned the trust of others? And yes, these are uncomfortable for technical people in particular, but if you look at the positive side, so long you prepare this well in advance, it will make a difference during and hopefully after the interview as well. Next, show grit or keep climbing. Tell me about the time when you persevered. What was the outcome? What, if anything, you do differently now? Okay, so this is a pretty self-explanatory question and behavior. One mistake you want to avoid here is to ensure the story is closely linked with your core area of expertise. Okay, ideally something you know they'd be particularly interested in, and you can sometimes spot this in the job description as well. Next one, insist on the highest standards. Describe a time when you refused to compromise your standards. What was the result? And this one from experience is pretty similar to the next one, so it's likely you'll only need one story for both at this stage of the interview prep at least. Demonstrate operational experience. Tell me about the time when you worked to improve the quality of a solution that was already getting good feedback. Why did you think it needed improvement? How did your manager react? So this shouldn't be too complex to brainstorm for, so I wanted to make a highlight here on something which is particularly important when giving convincing first answers, and that is the STAR format: situation, task, action, and results. Since these two are relatively easy principles, try to give your story or stories this format, this STAR format. And if you're wondering why is it important, well, actually the interviewers expect you to structure answers using the STAR format. Okay, and from experience, and by the way, I'm doing this for some time, people who follow this advice perform considerably better during interviews. Okay, next one, take ownership. Tell me about the time when you took on something significant outside of your area of responsibility. Why was it important and what was the outcome? Again, this is one of the easier principles to brainstorm for. However, from experience, this is tested in most interviews, so it's useful to prepare at least one story here as well. Okay, you basically have to convince them that you are the type of person who takes ownership. Technically ambitious. Tell me about the time when you didn't have enough data to make the right decision. What did you do? What path did you take? Did the decision turn out to be the correct one? So here I have to agree that I'm doing a little bit of guesswork when it comes to what they're actually interested in, but if I had to make a parallel with Amazon's principles for technical roles in particular, this would be I write a lot. And I know this is a bit counterintuitive, but this becomes more clear once you find a story of a time when your decision-making skills prevailed in a context of ambiguity. Embrace Team Blue. Tell me about the time when you received critical feedback. How did you respond? What was the outcome? Okay, so this principle is one of the key differences between Amazon and Blue Origin. Amazon only has earned trust when it comes to screening candidates on interpersonal skills, whereas Blue Origin has a dedicated principle to screen for teamwork, which is also closely linked to interpersonal skills and trust. Okay, so hopefully you're able to come up with a strong story here as well. Next one, practice humility. Tell me about the time when you failed. What are some lessons learned? What would you have done differently? So failure stories are some of the toughest to come up with for technical candidates in particular, and I'll even dare to predict that it will take you 3 attempts to come up with a proper failure stories. To give you a little tip here, when it comes to structuring your STAR answers, the result part should focus on your learnings. Okay, so I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.